Hey guys, welcome to the renal chapter. My name is Cam, and in this section of the chapter we will be discussing renal embryology. Now the renal system is a very interesting system and can seem pretty complex, but don't get your ureters in a twist because by the end of this lecture this information will be flowing through you like diuretics through a CHF patient. As we go through human renal embryology, I will point out how the system has become adapted to deal with the problems of a land-dwelling animal such as the Homo sapiens that we are, who have limited access to water, relatively speaking. So with that, let us flow on down to renal embryology. Let me start by reminding you that the renal system in land-dwelling animals like humans plays a very important role in eliminating nitrogenous wastes, while at the same time conserving water, H2O, which is a problem for all land-dwelling organisms, but it's quite the opposite actually for water-dwelling organisms. For example, freshwater animals face the problem of eliminating excess water, and marine animals must rid themselves of excess salt. And the anatomy and the embryology of these different organisms are shaped by the problems their environment imposes upon them. Now in humans, the development of the renal system and the nephrons within the renal system occurs in a distinct anterior to posterior gradient, as is the case with the other body tissues of the fetus. And as the body of the fetus develops in this anterior to posterior gradient, the nephrons actually follow a similar pattern of development so that they can rid the fetus of its nitrogenous waste as it continues to develop. And this is why the fetal nephrons begin anteriorly as the pronephros around week 4 of gestation, and then degenerate to be replaced later by the mesonephros. And the mesonephros functions as the kidney for the first trimester, and then later contributes to parts of the male genital system, such as the efferent ductules. Now the metanephros first appears in the 5th week of gestation. And what will it ultimately become? It will ultimately become the permanent functioning kidney. And nephrogenesis in the fetus continues through 32 to 36 weeks of gestation. Now, knowing the meaning of the prefixes of all these different nephros tissues will help you keep things in order. So, pro means before, so we know it's going to be the earliest tissue, and meta means after or beyond, so it becomes the permanent kidney beyond gestation of the fetus, and the only one left is meso, so it's in the middle. Now, the ureteric bud, labeled here as the ureteral bud, sometimes also called the ureteric bud, is derived from the caudal end of the mesonephros. And this ureteric bud is going to give rise to what will eventually be the ureter, the renal pelvises, the renal calyces, and the collecting ducts. Now, the metanephric mesenchyme, which is here, this is the metanephric mesenchyme, interacts with the ureteric bud. So it's seen here as well, the metanephric mesenchyme. Now, when the ureteric bud and the metanephric mesenchyme interact, the mesenchyme is induced to form the glomerulus and the nephron, all the way from Bowman's capsule up to the distal convoluted tubule. And aberrant interaction between these two tissues can give rise to a disease known as multicystic dysplastic kidney, where the kidney becomes a non-functional mass of cysts and connective tissue. And we're going to go over it more in these upcoming slides. So, let me ask you again, what does the metanephros give rise to? That's right, the adult kidney. Now, the ureters are going to develop as solid cords, and they become canalized later in development. And the uretero-pelvic junction, which will eventually be at this location between the kidneys and where the kidneys and the ureter meet. Now, that is where the ureters connect to the renal pelvis, and it's the last place to get canalized. So therefore, the most common site of failed canalization, which causes obstruction of urine flow and hydronephrosis, is at this uretero-pelvic junction. Now let's discuss what happens when renal system development goes wrong. So, if the renal system of the fetus fails to properly produce urine, which is also known as the blank fluid of the fetus, can you guess what the answer is? That's right. The urine of the fetus is also the amniotic fluid of the fetus. So if the amniotic fluid production fails, then a condition called Potter's syndrome can develop. And the lack of amniotic fluid around the fetus is also known as oligohydramnios. And we can understand this word by breaking down the roots of this word. And so oligo just means few, and hydra means water, and amnios refers to the amniotic sac. So there is basically very little water in the amniotic sac. And with too little amniotic fluid, the fetus suffers from compression by this muscular wall of the uterus. And as you can see in this picture, here is where the amniotic fluid is. This is the fluid, and this is the uterus wall. And as you can see in the picture, the amniotic fluid is preventing the mother's uterus from compressing down onto the fetus. And with too little fluid, this compression from this muscular uterus can lead to limb deformities in the fetus with Potter's syndrome, facial deformities, and pulmonary hypoplasia. Now, you might be asking, why the pulmonary hypoplasia? The pulmonary hypoplasia occurs because fetuses in utero normally swallow amniotic fluid into their lungs, which helps to expand their alveoli. Now, here's a question for you. What helps to keep the alveoli expanded after birth and is generally not produced in sufficient quantities in premature infants? The correct answer is surfactant. Be aware that the step 1 likes to test how impairment of one organ system affects the functioning of another organ system, which is what we saw in pulmonary hypoplasia due to decreased urine production by the fetus. So, the pulmonary hypoplasia is usually the primary cause of death in infants with Potter's syndrome. And causes of Potter's syndrome can include autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. So this is the causes. Other causes can also include posterior urethral valves, which are abnormal membranes in the posterior urethra that prevent urine flow from the bladder. And finally, bilateral renal agenesis. So, what is the common theme among all of these conditions in causing Potter's syndrome? The common theme is the inability of the fetus to produce urine, which is also the amniotic fluid of the fetus. So let's try out now a flash quiz to test what we've learned. List the following structures in order of appearance from earliest to latest. We have mesonephros, metanephros, pronephros. Take a minute to think and give an answer. The correct answer is pronephros. then mesonephros, and then metanephros. Now, these are not only appearing in order of earliest to latest, but remember that how we talked about renal development occurring in an anterior to posterior gradient. So you can also think of these as pronephros being the most anterior, then mesonephros, and then metanephros. Now let's talk about horseshoe kidney. During development, the kidneys rise from the pelvis until they reach their final position. Around which level? The correct answer is T12 to L3. T12 through L3. That will be the final position of the kidneys. Now, if the kidneys' inferior poles fuse, as you see here, before the ascent, they get trapped under the inferior mesenteric artery. They get trapped. Normally, which large anterior branch of the aorta do the kidneys lie next to and the renal vessels pass under? Normally, it's the superior mesenteric artery. So you get the sense that these horseshoe kidneys are going to be much lower due to being trapped under the inferior mesenteric artery. So the USMLE likes to test your knowledge of normal anatomy by asking you about changes to the anatomy that are seen in diseases. So be on the lookout for that. Now, horseshoe kidneys function normally, but they are predisposed to renal stones, renal cancer, such as Wilms tumor, and uretero-pelvic junction obstruction, and finally, hydronephrosis. Now, horseshoe kidney is commonly associated with which genetic abnormality? The correct answer is Turner syndrome, which is when patients have a karyotype of 45X. Next, multicystic dysplastic kidney, which is caused by the abnormal interaction of which two embryological structures that we studied before? The ureteric bud and the metanephric mesenchyme. This leads to a non-functional kidney consisting of cysts and connective tissue, like you see here. Remember that the ureteric bud interacts with the metanephric mesenchyme to induce proper nephron and glomerulus formation. Now, if it only happens unilaterally in the patient, it is generally asymptomatic, because the contralateral kidney can compensate via hypertrophy. However, a bilateral case would obviously be incompatible with life, because the patient would not have the ability to produce that urine, to produce amniotic fluid, and they would eventually end up with what? Potter's syndrome. So let's finish up the renal embryology section with a flash quiz. If a female patient has a karyotype of 45X, what artery might her kidney be trapped under? The answer is inferior mesenteric artery. Remember that patients with Turner syndrome are more likely to have the horseshoe kidney, which becomes trapped under the IMA as the kidneys try to ascend into the abdomen from the pelvis during development. So that's it for renal embryology. We'll see you next time.